Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for your time and energy that you are investing in the health of our democracy. You are investigating important issues related to how Canadians express their will as we elect our leaders. I very much appreciate the work that you are doing. I also appreciate this opportunity to address you regarding my own work. I teach computer science at the University of Waterloo, where I've been a faculty member for 25 years. I have also been interested in electoral reform for the last decade. Over the summer and into the fall, I combined my expertise in computer science with my interest in electoral reform to model many of the systems that have been proposed for Canada. Model is a critical word to understand in this context. This is the definition that I would like to use: the application of electoral system rules to data, producing results that assist in understanding the behavior of the system. I want to emphasize the last phrase. I'm trying to understand the overall behavior of electoral systems. My goal is not to predict who wins and who loses under a different system. That goal has many difficulties, including voters changing how they vote when the system changes. Instead, I'm attempting to use past elections to see if the system is well behaved. If it has been well behaved in many such elections, we can expect it to be well behaved in future elections, even if voters change how they vote. What does it mean for a system to be well behaved? I think this committee's own mandate provides a helpful definition that I'm sure you'll recognize. A well-behaved system reduces distortion and strengthens the link between voter intention and the election of representatives. Distortion is introduced when representation in government is significantly different from the level of popular support expressed in the election. A well-behaved system should not be arbitrary or erratic. First past the post, for example, will award a party earning 40% of the vote anywhere from 0 to 338 seats in the House of Commons. With a well-behaved electoral system, a small change in the votes cast should result in only a small change in the MPs elected. Another way to say that is that in a well-behaved system, the number of MPs awarded is proportional to the number of votes earned. With that preamble, let's dig into the meat of my results. Graphs like this are central to my methodology for understanding whether a system is well behaved. It shows the proportionality of an electoral system across 7 sets of data. This graph is for first past the post and shows what a misbehaving system looks like. In contrast, here's the graph of the rural-urban system. It is well behaved. Notice how each pair of colored lines track each other closely. Let's take a few moments to understand these graphs. The center, at 0%, represents the data from an actual election. In this case, first past the post, 2015. The heavy points are the percentage of the popular vote for a particular party. The Liberals earned almost 40% of the votes, the Conservatives 32%, and so on for the other parties. The lighter points reflect how the parties were rewarded with MPs in the House. The Liberals' 39% vote share turned into 54% of the MPs at the expense of the other parties, who received fewer MPs than they deserved. In 2015, first past the post was a misbehaving electoral system. But this is old news. We knew this on election night. What value have I added? Remember that we want to see how each electoral system behaves in many different but realistic elections, not just in 2015. We can simulate a different election by taking the 2015 results and shifting 10% of each Conservative candidate's vote to the local Liberal candidate. That might reflect an election in which late-breaking good news for the Liberals swings voters to their camp. Applying the first-past-the-post voting rules to that set of data gives the Liberals 64% of the MPs with only 43% of the vote. If we swing 30% of the Conservative votes to the Liberals, they get 81% of the seats, but still don't have a majority of the votes. Meanwhile, the effect on the Conservatives is devastating. 7% of the seats, in spite of earning 22% of the votes. Of course, we can also simulate the movement of Liberal voters to the Conservatives. That is shown in the left side of the graph. Other graphs can simulate votes shifting between other combinations of parties. First-past-the-post misbehavior plays out in previous elections as well. These 4 graphs represent 4 real elections and 24 simulated elections. First-past-the-post did not give a proportional result in any of them. Let's move on to take a brief look at some of the other electoral systems. The rural-urban proportional system is very well behaved. Here's the graph applying those rules to the 2015 election data and simulated related elections where votes swing between conservatives and liberals. Recall that the heavy lines represent the popular vote, while the lighter lines indicate the number of MPs. The important thing to note is how the 2 lines track each other very closely. Here are the graphs based on earlier elections. In each case, the system is well behaved. I like the rural-urban proportional system as proposed by Fair Vote Canada because it addresses our huge disparity in riding sizes. It keeps our already huge ridings at about the same size by electing a single MP in those ridings. It gains proportionality by using multi-member ridings where higher population densities make that feasible. Finally, a small layer of top-up seats, like are used in MMP, offsets the disproportionality of the single-member seats. That top-up layer is important. Rural-urban proportional is inspired by Kingsley's proposal, but it is not the same. Kingsley's proposal leaves off the top-up layer. When we model that, the result is surprisingly good, but not as good as rural-urban. I've also modeled STV, single transferable vote, where with both small ridings averaging 4.1 MPs, as well as larger ridings averaging nearly 11 MPs. Both are well behaved, but predictably the system with the larger ridings does better. Modeling mixed member proportional, or MMP, with 2 sizes of top-up regions also shows that it is also well behaved. Alternative vote has the distinction of being the only system I modeled that misbehaved more than first-past-the-post. Using data from 4 real elections and 72 simulated elections, alternative vote did not produce a single proportional result. Another alternative that might seem attractive is to keep exactly the same riding boundaries that we have now, but enlarge the House with 10% more MPs, making them top-up seats similar to MMP. We might call this MMP Light if we elected MPs in the local ridings using first-past-the-post, or we could call it AV Plus if we elected MPs using the alternative vote. While both of these systems would be a step towards proportionality, my modeling shows that it would be a very small step, even with the best-case scenario of calculating top-up seats over each province, rather than smaller regions, as is common with MMP. A 10% top-up simply is not enough to overcome the disproportionalities of all those single-member ridings. But if we use exactly the same constraints with the rural-urban system, that is, 32 extra MPs assigned to top-up seats and calculated at the provincial level, we get a well-behaved system. Thank you for your attention thus far. I've gone over some very detailed and technical material. You may feel at this point like my brother, who said, "That makes my head hurt." Nevertheless, I believe it is important information for your decisions. Let me summarize. First-past-the-post frequently misbehaves. Secondly, alternative vote is worse than first-past-the-post. Thirdly, STV, MMP, and rural-urban are all well-behaved across many different simulations. And lastly, MMP Light, half-hearted attempts like MMP Light and AV Plus are only slightly better than what we have now. Rural-urban, under exactly the same constraints, is excellent. The program that I've written and the input data is available for anyone to download and run or modify. The results I've shown here are readily available on the web at electionmodeling.ca. Thank you again for your attention and for the incredible service that you are performing for Canada. I look forward to your questions on my comments here, as well as my earlier submission to the committee.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to start by saying I had a delightful meeting about 2-3 weeks ago, maybe it was a month now, with Darren Hughes in my office. We meant to meet for half an hour and stayed for 2 hours. It was really, really informative. Darren, don't take this the wrong way if I address all my questions to Professor Becker instead. Professor, I want to ask you a series of questions because you, well, for one thing, you run a number of models, and I want to explore a bit of them, but I want to start by dealing with something you raised in your written submissions to this committee, but which you did not raise in your presentation this evening, and that is the metric that you use to judge whether or not a system is proportional, and that's the Gallagher Index. Could you just chat with us a bit about what the Gallagher Index is and how you apply it to your models?
Sure. So in the graphs that we looked at earlier, there's always a gap between the percentage of votes and the percentage of MPs. And what the Gallagher Index does is takes all of those gaps and expresses them as a single number. Rather than saying, well, the Liberals are overrepresented by 15% and the Conservatives are underrepresented by 7% or whatever, it takes those numbers and puts them into a single number. And we can talk about how it does that if you want, but that's the intent. One of the downfalls of the Gallagher Index is that overrepresentation in, say, Alberta can be offset by overrepresentation in, say, the Maritimes. And that does not show up in the classic Gallagher Index. So I adapted it to what I call the Composite Gallagher Index. I calculate the Gallagher Index for each region of the country and then average them together so that disproportionalities in the Maritimes and disproportionalities in Alberta both contribute to an overall picture of how proportional the system is.
So, first of all, to be clear, if we go to your written material, the material that was submitted to us, in that we would find the Composite Gallagher Index being used, not the original Gallagher Index. Is that correct?
I use both. I present both of them.
Okay, all right. And just so I make sure I'm crystal clear on this, it was the case when the first Prime Minister Trudeau was in office, you would have situations where he had 0 seats in Alberta and all but 1 of the seats in, or all but 2 of the seats in Quebec. Those would have canceled each other out and given the impression that the system was actually more equitable than since it was less equitable, but it appeared more equitable than it would have been if he'd merely had the disproportion either up or down in only one of those regions. Is that correct?
That's correct. The classic Gallagher Index does not account for those regional disparities. The composite one does.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that. I mentioned this for the benefit of colleagues. I mentioned this in part because I think if we are looking towards, if the committee is trying to design proportional alternatives to the status quo, then the Composite Gallagher Index would be a good way of testing the various models that might be looked at. I assume it's the case, Professor, to return to you, that we could assert that when you're faced with multiple versions, say, of multi-member proportional or multiple versions of STV, that one could actually set as one's goal accomplishing the lowest Gallagher Index number that is compatible with the hard barriers we face, such as the fact that we have to have all our seats within single provinces. Would that be correct?
Yes, the composite Gallagher is an excellent measure of the disproportionality of a system, and the lower that number, the better. But I think it's also fair to say that, you know, once we get in the 2, 3, 4% range, at that point, I have a hard time making the claim that decreasing it even further needs to be our primary goal. I think once we've got it down in the 2, 3, 4% range, that then our goal can shift to, you know, which one is simpler, or which one preserves the connection between the MP and the local voter better.
So when you get down to those very low numbers, I gather pushing them down further may require heroic measures such as doubling the size of the House of Commons or increasing riding sizes vastly larger than they are now in order to get another couple of % improvement. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. And those heroic measures, in my estimation, once we're already down to the 2 or 3%, just aren't worth it. There's the law of diminishing returns. There's more important stuff to pay attention to at that point.
Okay, so that's very helpful. I wanted now to turn to the models you've worked on. I had this conversation with you just a bit earlier. You provide numerous models that involve adding seats to the 338 we already have. For example, the most recent model you circulated to us, the AV Plus model, involves 32 list seats being added on. I have a concern that if we were to do that, if time were not an issue, this wouldn't be a problem. But time is an issue. We've got the 2019 deadline approaching us. And I'm worried that we would run into the issue of having to confirm with the courts the constitutionality of doing this because of the fact that Section 52 of the BNA Act 1867, or Constitution Act 1867, says the number of members of the House of Commons may from time to time be increased by the Parliament of Canada, provided the proportionate representation of the provinces prescribed by this Act is not thereby disturbed. You have to disturb it to some degree, and obviously the courts would say some degree is permissible, but not too much. Once we go into trying to sort that out before the courts, the 2019 deadline may be lost. So the question I have is, would it be possible for you to model some additional models that assume we start with the 338 MP cap we have now, but that try to be as close to the lowest possible number on the Gallagher Composite Index, with some, looking at STB, MMP, and also rural urban. Would it be possible to do that and come back, submit those back to us?
Very briefly, please, if you can.
Sure. I do have a day job, so I want to talk more with you about exactly what you're asking for, but I would be willing to make myself available to this committee for more modeling work.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Cullen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all our panelists here tonight. This is one very rich field that I want to get into, and so time is of an essence. Thank you for that most recent offer, Mr. Becker. Basically, if I understand it, as I look through your graphs, that the steeper and more dramatic the curve is, the more misbehaving, the more distortion that's going on within the system. Is that
Not quite.
Not quite. What am I wrong about?
It's hard to tell on these monitors, but those lines come in colored pairs. There's 2 red ones, 2 green ones, 2 blue ones.
Yeah,
we
and
want
the more they separate.
And the more they separate, the more misbehaving the system is.
So first past the post is bad.
Yes.
Alternative vote, worse.
Yes.
Okay, that's helpful. So if we wanted to distort the results even more, if we wanted to have votes reflected even less, we would take the system we have now and throw it into an alternative vote system.
That's correct.
Okay. So that's good, because that's not the intention of this committee, nor its mandate. So our mandate, just for context, I'm sure you all read our mandate, but is to change. This is to offer to the government some ideas and then a model which we recommend for change to improve our system, to make it a better behaving system, a more accurate system. In that context for change, and I want to turn to you, Mr. Hughes, for a moment, is
19 place visits in 10 provinces and 3 territories. So I had thought, and you'll have to forgive me, I had thought our theme song was, I've been everywhere, man, but I now want to change it to, ain't misbehaving, saving my votes for you. But anyway, I'm going to ask you some questions, Mr. Weber-Becker, forgive me, and I'm going to try to get also to Darren Hughes and try to get some questions to Dominion voting systems. But I'm going to start because your summary says, first past the post frequently misbehaves. And if I heard your evidence correctly in the models you ran, it always misbehaves. Is that a fair statement based on the models you ran?
Yes.
Okay, so...
I was trying to be generous.
So it's a misbehaving system that has not ever reflected in your checking out our past elections the way Canadians actually voted.
Correct.
And the only thing worse than that is alternative vote.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm wondering, given, and I'm very grateful that you already answered the question that you to Mr. Reid, that you'd be prepared to continue to help us with modeling. Did you look, I don't think you did, but did you look at dual member proportional, which is another system that has been presented to us?
No, I have not looked at dual member proportional yet.
Okay. And did you made the point that the rural-urban proportional was similar to Mr. Kingsley's model. You didn't run is there any reason you didn't do a modeling of Mr. Kingsley's proposal?
I have done a modeling of Mr. Kingsley's proposal. I didn't show a graph because it shows it the graph makes it look very good. But if you look at the Composite Gallagher Index, which I did not have enough time to talk about, it shows that it's not as good as it could be.
In the terrible risk that you might not ever again have enough time to talk about the Composite Gallagher Index, would you give us another bit of time on that, knowing that I want to move along? Can you give us a sense of it?
Sure. Once again, the Composite Gallagher Index takes into account disproportionality between different regions of the country. And for Mr. Kingsley's proposal, in the simulations or the modeling that I did, it appeared to be very proportional, but in fact, regionally, it was disproportional.
Okay, thank you. So the Composite Gallagher Index revealed that, which is something that we should bear in mind when we're doing further analysis.
Mr. Becker, I would like to start with you. I believe that what you showed us was quite outstanding and irrefutable. It shows the advantages of proportional versus first past the post, but what I'd like to say is this. We've often heard that a proportional system could create political instability, but in the facts, that's not necessarily the case. That system is not necessarily more unstable than first past the post systems. There have been more elections. There have not been more elections in Canada. There have been more elections in Canada than countries with mixed proportional systems. I would like you to tell us a little more, perhaps not during 7 minutes, but tell us more on your conclusions on the instability of public policy under the first past the post system.
So I'm not sure that my simulations really have much to say about the instability of public policy. That's not something that I've attempted to model. I'm not sure that that's something I can model.
Vous aviez eu des propositions dans votre présentation.
In your presentation, I thought you had spoken to that, but now I'll move on to Mr. Hughes. Good evening to all of you. My first question is for Mr. Becker. First of all, Mr. Cullen told me that you are a fantastic witness. You even provided us with a list of questions, so I will use that list. I will use that list to ask my first question, and I'll just change 2 words to that question. Question 4, which says that alternative vote seems to be a valid option for many Canadians, and what I would add is that it would also be valid for our Prime Minister, who would be the chief person interested. Why do you believe, I would like to know exactly what your views are on the alternative voting system.
Say that that list of questions was not meant to be distributed. That was for me to have in my hip pocket just in case everybody gave me a blank look. But nevertheless, since you have them, let me address it. I think that alternative vote makes a lot of sense at the individual riding level. Or let me say that I can appreciate why it would be attractive at the individual riding level. I think there are also some problems at the individual riding level, but I can understand why it seems attractive at that level. However, each individual riding, the decision is made independently of all the others. Same as first past the post. And it's when you aggregate all of those individual decisions that it breaks apart and becomes a disadvantage for Canada as a whole. I have sometimes compared it to the economic theory of the tragedy of the commons, where a village has a common pasture, and everybody grazes their cow on that common pasture, and it works out wonderfully, as long as everybody obeys the rules. But then some bright soul says, but I can graze 2 cows on that pasture. They make a locally optimal decision just for themselves. It's like the riding, individual riding saying, it's best for us to do alternative vote. But if everybody does that, the pasture gets overgrazed and everybody fails. If all the ridings use alternative vote, then the system as a whole becomes very disproportional and Canada as a whole suffers.
Merci beaucoup. Ma deuxième...
Thank you very much. My second question is for you again, Mr. Becker. We've heard all kinds of witnesses and we've spoken with our constituents in our ridings. Local representation comes up time and time again. Under a proportional system, most witnesses have said that the number of ridings would decrease, rather that there would be fewer local MPs and more list MPs. I believe that my colleague Mr. Reid touched on this issue in his question. If we decided to maintain 338 ridings across the country, in your view, how many list MPs should we have to at least have a better proportional representation without necessarily aiming for the best or most ideal result possible? Is there a way we could avoid adding 200 or 300 extra MPs while maintaining our current 338? Is there any way we can get these list MPs to come on board, and would Canadians support this approach?
Number of different models, some of which maintain 338 MPs, make the ridings a little bit bigger as needed to make room for those extra list MPs while still maintaining 338. I have also run simulations or models where we keep 338 ridings, for individual MPs and add on the top-up layer as well. I think the optimal system, from my perspective, that meets your criteria either way would be the rural-urban. That maintains very good proportionality while still having just a very modest layer of top-up MPs, as few as 50 about, which is significantly less than MMP for the same degree of proportionality.
Je vous posais la question parce que c'est quelque chose, je crois pas qu'on a...
I was asking you the question because I don't think we really discussed this. Every 10 years, the chief electoral officer increases the number of MPs because the population increases. So I think it might be an idea to increase the number of MPs, not as quickly, but increase more list MPs. And this could happen proportionately and progressively. Do you think this could be a good approach? So to take small steps to one day reach the number of MPs to reach the good proportional number?
An incremental approach. The question, I think, is, can we trust those in power to actually follow through on the good intentions? Can we trust those in power to actually, add the new MPs to that top-up or to the list? If we can indeed trust that, what you have suggested is a nice incremental way to move from our current system to a proportional system.
So I want to start with you, Mr. Becker. With regard to rural and urban proportional, which I understand you're advocating for or saying is the best of all the systems that you've looked at, I'm wondering if you can explain the legitimacy of a member directly accountable to its own constituency and riding, such as in the rural area as you're proposing, versus one that is elected amongst other members who doesn't necessarily have one single constituency who can say, that's my MP and I want to hold him accountable if he doesn't do what I think he should do. Can you explain how the different levels perhaps of accountability or legitimacy would be reconciled in Parliament?
So I think it's important at this point to draw analogies from what Mr. Hughes talked about with mixed member proportional, because it's very much the same, that there are MPs that have broader, you know, the top-up MPs, as I've often referred to them, have broader responsibilities and than do MPs that were in the local ridings. And I think it would be very much like mixed member proportional. They can address broader issues, not just issues specific to their local place. For those MPs that are in multi-member ridings, come from densely populated areas, there we can look to the analogy of single transferable vote and other places where there are multiple members. And they would be, in a sense, each of them responsible to their whole larger riding, okay, in terms of policy. But for constituency work, they might very well carve it up and say, you know, this part of the riding is your job and this part of the riding is your job.
And just kind of very similar to the first question, but how, I would imagine that in an urban riding where you've got multi-member, there could be hard-working MPs that are taking on the vast majority of the work, for example, and the one who's not working very hard or who's not necessarily representing the people or doing a good job kind of gets lumped in and isn't held accountable. Could you comment on the problem that may create in some MPs perhaps being better MPs and dragging along those who aren't performing very well?
I think the voters are smart enough to tell the difference. And I think that those freeloaders, if we can use that term, would pay the price in the next election. And, you know, it could be that they can attract enough votes to still squeak by, but it also might be the case that they're turfed out in favor of somebody else.
Okay, thanks. I want to move.
If Mr. Reid could have everyone's attention, please, that would be ideal.
So you may recall at yesterday's meeting, I indicated while I was asking him questions, I said I'll be trying to get back to you with some suggestions about other models that you haven't done that are similar to that are within the three families of proportional models that I think are most high profile in the discussion in Canada. Those being STV, MMP, and the rural-urban model. And so I said for each of them, would you be able to run something that does not run into problems with the issue of proportionate representation under the Constitution, which could occur if you add seats. And so this is an attempt to actually give him three of these, one model for each of these three categories. The goal being to say it has to comply with the first restriction being it has to comply with no new seats for any province. You get exactly the same number of seats, or the same number of MPs rather, as you had under the 2000. And I see it as an error here. I see 2011. I actually meant to say 2015 redistribution. So forgive that. It's 2015. Secondly, the redistribution has to be capable of being executed on an expedited basis, which means any redistribution cannot be something like we see here, 9 seats becoming 8, which would require a full 2-year-long redistribution, but rather the briefer redistribution that is possible if you simply merge 2 ridings or 3 ridings or whatever together. And for all of this, once you've complied with those 2 restrictions, try to make this as proportional as possible, and the technology or the metric for measuring that is the Composite Gallagher Index. So that's what I've tried to accomplish here, and to have us ask him to prepare those models for us. I would love to pass this tonight, but if people want to take it home, I'll accept waiting until Tuesday. I just mentioned the obvious constraint that we are trying to get this stuff back. Our negotiations are supposed to be wrapped up on the 10th of November, and so getting something back to him earlier is preferable to doing it later, but I leave that to the committee's discretion.
Ms. May. Mr. Cullen.
Yeah, this is good. I too feel that sense of urgency for anything the committee wants to really consider. We need to get at it pretty quickly. My only thought is in asking for more time, because at first blush, these two conditions that you've got down here, Scott, seem fine. But I have this inkling that there might be just one other condition, just in terms of guiding his process. I just feel if we set him off in a course that we then say, oh no, you've given us some modeling that is actually stuff we can't consider because of X. So I wouldn't mind the extra bit of time, even though I get that sense of urgency also.
Sorry, do you mind if I respond to that before you go to the next person? Yeah, so Nathan, I appreciate that. The goal here is simply to make sure we've got something that will not cross a practical barrier, making it impossible to implement for 2019. That's, and you're right, there may be additional things. Those are the two that I know of.
But broadly, Chair, just in terms of the intention, totally in agreement, and I was impressed by Professor Becker's attempt to go at this a different way, which is track your proportionality rather than start from some opposite thing of imagine the house is 5% this way and 10%. That actually answers the wrong question. This answers the question that we're actually going for, which is the trade-off question we keep talking about. If you do this, you have to trade off that. So yeah, I'm in favor of it broadly. I wouldn't mind a bit of time just to see if there's a third condition that would be helpful.
I would support this entirely, and I was also impressed with, I don't know if it's Professor Weber-Becker or just Professor Becker, but he appears also to be prepared to continue to do work for us, work on this issue, without expecting a contract. So I don't think there's a financial issue. It's an extremely generous offer. He will need time because he has a day job. So I would urge that we move it forward now with some wiggle language towards the end that says, and any other conditions that strike us which don't slow down his work. I mean, if we tell him tomorrow, we really want you to do these, he can work all weekend. I mean, I think we're down to days that matter. And I'd rather let him know, thumbs up, we appreciate your civic-minded brilliance, and we like your Composite Gallagher Index, and we really want this work. And we may have another condition to tell you about later, if Nathan can live with that.
Okay, so any other comments? Is there, yes, Mr. DeCourcy?
I'd be happy to send this off now, and then any other addition would come back to this committee in the form of a motion.
Okay, so any addition would come in so I missed that part.
Are there any further conditions that we want?
Okay, I see.
This wouldn't be just unilaterally done. The committee would have to pass it.
We send this off. We ask Mr. Weber-Becker if he'll do this. That's what we're doing. So there seems...
All in favor?
The last sentence was where?
I don't think that, sorry, what Ms. May was saying? Yeah. I don't think she meant it as an addition, or I don't think Mr. Kersey meant it as an amendment, but you can ask him.
And any other condition?
No, there is no amendment. This motion will be passed as it's written now, and then if we discuss any other conditions that we want to
that would be through
append
a
to this, they would come forward in the form of a new motion.
Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, so there seems to be unanimity and no need for a vote. So we'll go ahead with that. Pardon?
So just to be clear, it's with the 2015, not the 2011. That was my error. Yeah. Okay, all right, thank you.
And I might as well, yeah, so are we in camera at the moment? No. Okay. No, but we'll be seeing each other on the 26th. I can.
25th, 26th, 27th.
No, I mean, we'll be informally getting together. You know, yeah, that's all. You'll be getting more information about that. Nothing earth-shattering, but normally we discuss that in camera. So, okay, well, thank you very much. Have a good weekend, everybody, and we'll see you next whenever. Thank you.